Dr. Eli, why are we still having conversations about monogamy in this day and age? I thought everybody's all for open relationships and come and go as you please. Are we really still invested in monogamous relationships?
I think it's important that people have a choice as to how they want to live their lives, and we shouldn't say that a non-monogamous relationship is preferable or better than a monogamous relationship. It's different for different people, and people should have a choice as to what works for them. The importance of that is also that people should be ethical around how they run their relationships. So whether that be a monogamous relationship or a non-monogamous relationship, people should negotiate that with their partner, should be able to have an open conversation about these things. I think partly what has happened and still happens a lot, particularly in more traditional setups and cultures, and particularly perhaps more in heterosexual relationships, is that we make assumptions about monogamy, and we assume that people will be exclusive both sexually and romantically with their husbands, wives, girlfriends, boyfriends, partners. Um, and we don't really talk about that or negotiate that. And so I think why we need to talk about monogamy and also about non-monogamy is that we can do either of these, both of these. It can also change, of course, it doesn't have to stay the same, but can do it in a way that is kind and respectful and ethical to each other.
And not assume that when you get into a new relationship or you start a new relationship that is going to be the the way you operate or the rules within your relationship.
Yes, although I think that within certain sort of context and cultural backgrounds, that assumption is perhaps more valid than in other contexts. Yeah, but the important bit is that we have to negotiate these things in order to make sure that we are on the same page and that we have a healthy relationship and not surprise each other a bit down the line, right? And those are very difficult conversations to have, and often people avoid those conversations, particularly if they might not want to have the typical monogamous relationship. But we're not being kind to ourselves or to our partner or partners, plural, if we make assumptions and we can't speak openly about where we are and what we want. Yeah.
Why do you think it is such an uncomfortable conversation to have?
Well, monogamy has been embedded culturally for hundreds of years. In different cultures, and it has a long history. And we've now come to an understanding for most people still, I think, where we assume that monogamy is sort of an aspect of human nature, an aspect of human sexuality, where in fact it is
Mm.
largely an economic construct that is very, very old. But it is so old that it has become almost natural, in inverted commas, for us to be. And so then for us to have to discuss this and speak about this requires us to step outside of something that might feel very familiar and comfortable. And we also police monogamy, and perhaps I've done so more in the past. So we have words that we use in derogatory ways where we particularly would refer to women if they have non-monogamous relationships, right? Because we have to police that in order to maintain a sense of monogamy. And so if I want to volunteer and say I want to step out of this, it requires me to almost step in a place where I anticipate that I will be judged and criticized for who I am, and probably will receive some criticism as well, right? So
Mm.
it requires a certain risk. If it is a new relationship, then somebody might fear that they might lose that possibility of a relationship. And equally, if it is a more permanent, long-standing relationship, again, they might fear that their partner, which is now very meaningful to them, the lives that they have together, that all of that might go if they start to want to speak about this.
Mm.
Yeah.
How has this been upheld over time and religious beliefs and cultures?
If we look into the history of monogamy, it started many, many hundreds of years, of thousands of years ago. And at the time, it was really motivated by more economic reasons. And the sort of basic essence of it, I mean, it's much more complex than I'm going to describe you, but the basic essence of this is, if a gentleman has property, is wealthy, then he wants to know that it's his offspring that will inherit that. And the way in which he can assure that is, of course, if he is the only person who has sex with his wife. And so in that sense, it became an economic thing that he wants to make sure his wealth is in his line, and therefore control his wife's sexuality, because it's very difficult to know who the father of the child is that she would give birth to, although it's very obvious who's the mother of that child, right? So in that sense, we started to control female sexuality a bit more. And the implication was that men would also be a little bit more monogamous in that sense. But of course, that didn't happen. And we then have versions of that. So we have polygamy, where a man might have several wives, but he would still be the husband to all, or the partner to all of those. And there is still some form of control, right? And then it has become culturally and religiously embedded. So it precedes some sort of cultural constructs even, right? And the one can argue that both the cultural and the religious ideas around this has functioned to keep it in place for the economic well-being of that. Now that we have live in a way that's perhaps more secular, or people are more personal around their beliefs, it's not necessarily always a structured, controlled system of belief. It can be a bit more flexible. People can also be a bit more malleable with all of these things. And we have other tools now that allow us to also be ethical, whilst we might still not be monogamous. And we don't have the same need for the economic aspect of monogamy anymore.
How did this construct play into what we're talking about what we believe about monogamy, that women had to be virtuous, she had to be a virgin, but it was quite acceptable for men to sow their oats and have many partners, because somehow that elevated their status in society, whereas you looked at a woman as of lesser value if she displayed that kind of mannerisms or choices.
We can't think about sex removed from socio-political context, right? So, at the time when you're talking about, women were economically disadvantaged. They didn't have incomes of their own, so they weren't economic agents where they could make decisions for themselves. They were dependent on men. Men had the power in money, and so therefore they also have the freedom of choice. And so a woman had to become, or had to remain, virtuous, because then she becomes a more desired object even for a more powerful man, right? And so it's all about his ownership and his control of her, at least to some extent. But you're quite right. Because he has the power, he also has the choice to have multiple women to sleep around. And we do see that there was a double standard around that. To some extent, we can argue there still is a double standard around that. Although what we have seen sort of since the mid-20th century with women becoming independent economic agents in their own right. Women own their own money and therefore can make decisions for themselves, are independent. Women also have a lot more control over their own sexuality. And so women don't necessarily feel that they have to be this virtuous person that becomes desired in that way. She can behave in a way that feels comfortable for her.
Yeah. How do we think about monogamy in this day and age?
I think there is a lot more scope and a lot more ability to contemplate that not everybody is monogamous or chooses to be monogamous. But I think we still have judgments of people who are perhaps not monogamous. And some of those judgments would be valid. You know, if somebody is dishonest and has a relationship or sexual experiences with somebody outside of the contract that they have with their partner, of course, that's just deceitful. And for us to be uncomfortable with deceit would be an appropriate response. But there are also ethical ways in which we can have non-monogamous relationships. And those kinds of relationships typically are more celebrated, are more accepted by communities or people within those communities. People
Mm,
within other communities might find it more difficult to understand that and might be more inclined to want to judge that, because we might also think that it's mainly men who want to do this. So men want to be able to have multiple female partners. Well, those men might actually also want to have some male partners. And equally,
mm,
it's not always
mm,
men that want to do that. One of the really fundamental texts that we have that help us to think about this is a book called The Ethical Slut. And this book was written by two women, and these two women describe about their non-monogamous relationships and how they have come to understand how to negotiate this with this partner. So we shouldn't assume that it is necessarily men who want non-monogamous relationships. And there's multiple versions of what that might look like and how polyamory or non-polyamory or whatnot might frame all of that. Yeah.
And I assume that is the kind of discussions one has at the beginning, at the start of a relationship, so that you are clear what the parameters of that particular relationship that you're in is. That and that you negotiate that, you discuss it.
Yeah. I would say it starts even before that. One has to be clear about oneself. One
Mm,
first has to be clear about what is it that I want from a relationship and how I want to enter into a relationship and become really comfortable with that so that I can then, when I meet a partner, be honest about the fact I only want to have a monogamous relationship. I can't be with a partner who doesn't want that right from the start, or the other way around, that I want to have a non-monogamous relationship, so that instead of being invested in first establishing a relationship, we have to be invested in entering into the possibility of a relationship with our own honest, well established identity and thoughts
mm.
around monogamy or non monogamy.
Are these new relationship models, and I'm only calling it a model because we touching on so many aspects of what relationships look like today. Are they more honest? Or is it just convenient to create the the back door, so that you live your full life, your best sexual life in that regard?
I think the intention of them are to be more honest. Whether that always happen is another thing. These non-monogamous relationships can also break down. They can also have difficulties, but usually the difficulty is not because somebody has another sexual partner or another romantic partner, but it is that the rules that they have agreed to are broken. So it might
Mm,
be that in a non-monogamous relationship, I agree with my partner that it's fine for me to have sexual encounters with other people, but not have actual romantic encounters with someone else. And then if I establish a romantic connection with somebody, that might then end my relationship with my primary partner, not because I've slept with other people, but because I've actually formed a connection and that was not part of the agreement. Or it might be something very
mm,
simple and practical, which is
mm,
yes, you can have other sexual experiences, but not in our bed. And then if somebody brings somebody into the bed, that becomes problematic. So the rules can be negotiated. It's very difficult to negotiate those rules. And the
mm,
difficulties come when those rules are broken rather than the fact that it's an open relationship as such. But you're quite right. It requires a certain amount of honesty. It requires a certain amount of honesty with oneself and comfort with oneself as well to be able to engage in those relationships. It also requires, very importantly, the ability to consent. And, people can consent in a way where they feel reluctant about consenting to something, and that is unlikely to be a successful outcome from that. Within sex therapy, there's a concept of enthusiastic consent, which is that somebody can very enthusiastically agree to whatever it is that they agree to, right? Including non-monogamy, rather than a bit of a reluctance. In order for me to maintain my partner, I have to go along with this, right? Um, and it brings up all sorts of other feelings around jealousy and envy, loneliness, perhaps even, you know, yeah, it's a very complex thing, and it is not necessarily a free for all, or it's not necessarily kind of a for everybody a better solution, because
Mm.
it's a lot of work, a lot of psychological work to be able to hold all the boundaries in clear ways and negotiate all of that. Very different to a couple perhaps agreeing to just have sexual experiences with other people, you know. Yeah.
I don't know if you can recall back in the day when Facebook started, you had to select where you were in a relationship, what your relationship status was, whether you were single in a relationship, divorced. And then they had a category that said open relationship. And that used to spark quite a lot of discussion. Are
Mm.
we more relaxed? Are we more comfortable saying that we are in open relationships or we are fluid? What's the take on that, and how is it perceived and dealt with?
I think generally we make assumptions about what those terms mean. So when we say open relationship, does that mean that I can sleep with anybody I want? Or does it mean I can have other relationships with other people? Does it mean that with my partner, I need to tell them about these experiences that I have or don't? So, open relationship is an umbrella term. And I think the
Mm,
problem with it is that we think we are all on the same page when we use it, and that we understand what we are agreeing to, but we've not
mm,
actually considered what that is. But I think in reality, perhaps particularly for younger people, if a friend or a colleague were to describe that they are in an open relationship, then it is probably a bit more familiar, a little bit easier to make sense of that than it would have been, say, 20 years ago, where people would have struggled to understand that concept or how people might live in such a way.
mm. And what I'm just thinking, how do you even navigate a conversation where you might want to be, or something that you want to pursue, but you also know your partner is not in favor of that, or is not comfortable with that, or holds on to very traditional view of their sexuality or what monogamy is? How do you even bridge that kind of very deep conversation that needs to be had?
And Lynette, the scenario that you create would be for a couple that has been together for some time. So they would have entered into that relationship with a particular contract of monogamy. I would anticipate that that's probably an assumption of monogamy rather than
Mm,
an agreed state that people just both assume that we will be monogamous with each other. And then one partner changes his or her mind. And of course, we also in a moment just have to speak about same-sex relationships where it might be slightly
mm,
different, right? Um, but the first step of that is that the person who might want to have that conversation have to consider which loss could they tolerate. And what I mean by that is when I have this conversation or when I have this concept with somebody, I am asking for something and I'm going to lose something as well. So I'm either going to lose the possibility of having an open relationship and remain in a monogamous relationship, um, or I might risk losing the really meaningful relationship if it is indeed a meaningful
mm.
relationship to me. And so the question then is not in the first instance, how do I have that relationship? The question is, which loss can I tolerate?
Wow.
What bit is more important here for me to be open about sex, relationships, etc., to have that, or to maintain the relationship that I have? Because you can't have, no, you can't, but it might be difficult to have both of those if your partner is not open to that as well. Right? If it is that it feels important enough for you to be able to have an open relationship, then you have to enter that conversation with your partner with an understanding that you might lose that partner, and then to enter that without being defensive or stubborn or self-righteous, but in a way of being open and honest and kind to your partner as well about their anxieties, their fear, their discomfort with that, right?
Mm.
And the other part of that, of course, is we're also going to hurt. We're either going to hurt ourselves or we're going to hurt our partner, or perhaps both. And we need to be comfortable with that as well. But I think what you highlight there is perhaps the assumption that was initially made, but also it might be that, and it has happened in my experience, where when the topic is introduced, the other partner has never thought about that. But then in thinking about that, there's also freedom in both ways. And what
Mm.
often happens is that people don't necessarily act on it, that they don't necessarily want to, but it's okay then for us to think about ourselves and our relationship and our sexual experiences. It gives a lot of freedom just to talk about these things, right? And I said
Mm.
earlier on that we
So,
also, I was going to say
yeah,
we
we
spoke
want to
earlier
touch
on.
on same sex.
Yes, and we've learned a lot from same-sex experiences, particularly male-to-male sexual experiences, where monogamy is not the assumed place where a relationship necessarily start, right? Because the sexual experiences often are framed very differently than within a relationship necessarily, right? And so um, we've learned from gay male couples that there is more of a practice of negotiating this, talking about this, not making assumptions about this, then perhaps agreeing to something which might very well be a
Mm.
monogamous relationship that the couple agrees to. But the assumption at the start of the relationship is not always the same. It is a different assumption that allows for the conversation to happen. My um, clinical opinion is, and the same should happen for heterosexual couples, it's not that people should have open relationships, but rather that people should, right from the start, speak about it, negotiate it, and come to an understanding of what works, rather than an assumption of how and we're going to be with each other. Yeah.
Mm. I've often read and heard couples talk about when you've been in a relationship for so long, um, we assume the man introduces the conversation and says, you know, we've been together for so long, let's spice it up. The woman's response is, but this wasn't part of what I signed up for. So what is
Mm.
changing now? Um, how do you have that conversation? How do you even, if you've always been traditional, and just this is for the lack of a better term, traditional in your approach, you've always been monogamous, and that's what you had vowed to each other when you were married, and now things are changing for whatever reason. How do you have that conversation with your partner?
With great difficulty. Um, you can't assume that this is going to be an easy thing and just be able to sort of enter into that and start that conversation. You have to first be okay with yourself to enter into that conversation and anticipate how your partner might respond. And as it is that you are raising that, then not become defensive if your partner becomes
Mm.
critical, becomes quite upset or anything like that, that they are wrong or they're close-minded or anything like that. But you have to hear and have empathy for their reality as well. um, and it might be that such a conversation is not an conversation, but it is actually over a long period of time, several conversations that might start with, how are we doing as a couple? How are we? And what works and what doesn't work. And from there on, building onto a conversation, but not in a way of being dishonest, of I'm going to ask you how we are
Mm.
because actually I want to sleep with somebody else, right? Uh, but to be sincere in the conversations that you wish to have. But Lynette, also just to raise something here, we assume, as you quite rightly say, it would be the man who want to do that,
Mm.
but it is not always the case.
I know.
Female sexuality is very powerful and much more complex than we would like to frame it. And if you read books about the two, one very famous book, Nancy Friday's book, My Secret Garden, is about
Mm.
women's sexual fantasies. That was written in the 60s and 70s. When you read that, women are not necessarily invested in monogamy. Women, I mean, and of course, what women fantasize is not necessarily, well, people, men as well, is not necessarily what they
Yes.
want to do, right? But we shouldn't assume that this is a gendered thing and that it is men who want to do this only. And what we see often in when this happens is that it might be the man who initiates it, but then the woman who
Mm.
eventually takes the lead. And that the problem is that she becomes more invested in this than he might be, and that's then the strain. Yeah,
And the conversations that evolve from that is, if we go down this route, there's no way back to it, or the one partner is defensive and says, but am I no longer enough for you? Why, why suddenly this?
sure, sure.
So there's so many questions and responses that
Yeah,
come from this. I'm wondering if you can maybe give us context in terms of how do we then have this conversation, and if it in any way comes up, if you in a very religious context, Muslim or Orthodox Jews, for example, where the constructs are this is what it looks like. If you do within a Muslim relationship or marriage, if you do want to have a second wife, you must have a conversation with the first wife and, in a way, have permission. That is fine. And then within African culture, for example, as well, let's talk about how that, if at all, fits in within those
sure,
relationships
sure.
and cultures.
I think some of those religious groups and those cultural groups, these conversations and these concepts are actually easier to understand and to negotiate because it's either entirely forbidden, and so we can't even go there, so we can't even allow ourselves to think about that. Or, as you describe in Muslim culture, there are already rules that one has to follow in order to achieve that. So there are some guidelines as to how do we achieve that. The
Mm,
same within African culture. My understanding of that is, although a man might have many wives, those are his wives, and he's not having any form of relationship with anybody other than his wives. So there's
other than
still
that.
there's still some sense of monogamy, although it is plural monogamies, if you like,
Mm,
but
mm,
it's not
mm.
a license to just go and sleep with anybody or have any relationship. So there are still rules that everybody follow, that makes it safe, that makes it easier for people to have those conversations and negotiations. It becomes more complex if we think in a secular Western society that don't have those constructs, those religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds that provide some sense of guidance, if you like, as to how do we enter into this, then it is a little bit clumsy and we need to find our way with that, which might make it a lot more difficult. We might also have to hold that within certain cultural and religious constructs, as I said, it is not a possibility, and then we should respect
Mm.
that. So then again, as I said earlier on, which loss is the loss that I can tolerate? Is it the loss of my religion or my cultural identity in order to have a relationship structure that is foreign to that? Or is it this idea that I have of a alternative relationship structure that I can lose, but I in favor of retaining my religious or cultural background? Yeah.
I'm wondering if monogamy has become the safe space where we know exactly what we're signing up for, that somehow it's become a moral compass for many people to navigate their relationships and their marriages. Or is it a construct that we've clung to because it makes sense, because it helps us to navigate and make sense of this of the marriage or the relationship?
Yes, I mean, there's lots of benefits in monogamy. We shouldn't say that it's a bad thing or a wrong thing. There's lots of benefits, and one of those would be
Awesome.
that it helps us to make sense of the world. It makes sure that we know who our partner is in a very health way. We are less likely to contract all sorts of infections and diseases if we know we're in a monogamous relationship. So there's lots of benefits around that, right? And this is what I said at the start. It's not to say one is better than the other. It's rather what
Mm,
works for
mm,
me and how do I negotiate that. I think the one thing that I, again, just come back to is, if we want to have a safe relationship, and that's why we choose a monogamous relationship, we still have to, in terms of our mental health, particularly a bit down the line, make sure that that is actually a safe relationship. And it becomes safe when I feel safe that I can speak about who I am and share my feelings, even if they are
Mm,
difficult, awkward, and uncomfortable. I mean, how many couples would feel comfortable to just point out to their partner when they see somebody else that is attractive? Nothing other than that's an attractive guy, that's an attractive woman, without
mm.
the partner becoming defensive or interpreting it other than that, right? And I think even that becomes problematic for people. And then we expect people to somehow not notice that, or if they do notice it, pretend they don't and feel guilty that they do. And it becomes quite complex in that way, So in that sense, monogamy then is not safe. It actually can become quite a strain, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting because I think we have also seen in life that um, when you have a conversation with on social media, especially where men tend to say they're too scared to show their appreciation for another woman because their partner might interpret it as, oh, so you want to sleep with her, or that
Yes.
kind of thing. So that they have not sorted out between themselves. I quickly then want to talk about why we still have such a strong response when we talk about cheating, or when you have chosen another partner. Why, if we say this is what we hold true, or this is what works for us in a relationship, why is that still elicit such a strong response?
The same response would come even from people who are non-monogamous and have
Mm,
multiple partners. It is not the other partner; it is the cheating, right? It's the dishonesty of it, which is then you have lied to me and I can't trust
mm,
you. So if the way in which you describe cheating, that kind of cheating is based on either a negotiation or an assumption of we won't have other partners. And now you have gone and you've had another partner. And so for many people, it's almost not the fact that you have had the other partner as much as it is that you have lied to me, you have been dishonest, and you have done something
mm,
that we have agreed or I have assumed that we won't be doing, right? Um, and as you know, the same thing, it might be that a couple say, when we're on holiday, we will have a threesome with another person. And that's what we agree. And then when we do it on holiday, that's perfectly fine. But then on the average Tuesday evening, if you ask me to invite somebody else over, that becomes really problematic because that's not quite the rule that we had. And that then, it's not quite cheating, but it goes in the same direction of the dishonesty, the outside of the contract of what we've agreed.
mm.
And so, yes, we have these strong responses because of the dishonesty of it. Yeah. And then of course there
S-
are also the other layers of that, which is, what does it mean if my partner wants to have somebody else that they want to have sex with, or have had somebody else that they have sex with? And usually it is a reflection on us. So I am not desirable enough, I am not
mm,
somehow enough. And that might not be the case at all, but it might be your own insecurity that you feel not enough, um,
mm.
that then gets activated in that event, um, where the cheating, the dishonesty is the main trigger, if you like.
Mm. So are we saying that non-monogamous relationships are more honest because it acknowledges that there's human desire and one evolves and would want to have different experiences, sexual different experiences?
I wouldn't say that because I don't think we can make a blanket statement about any kind of relationship, right? But what I would say is non-monogamous relationships, by its very definition, requires a, a certain ability to negotiate, to agree, to discuss, to come to an understanding. Um, and so, in that, it requires a certain amount of honesty. to be able to do that. But to say that therefore all non-monogamous relationships are more honest, I think that's maybe a step too far. We can't make that assumption. Yes.
So when we talk about monogamous relationships in this day and age, where does ethics come into play or
Mm.
in the conversation?
If we think about the basics of ethics, one aspect of that is to be respectful of each other, to be mindful of how my actions impact on somebody else, and how I want to reduce any negative impact that I might have on anybody else, right? And I think we are generally a little bit more aware of ethics, even in the commercial world. How does having a car that uses diesel that is not well
Mm.
maintained pollute the air, and that's an unethical. So it's about harm and how do we limit harm and all of those things. And so the ethics of that is, how do I have a relationship, a monogamous or a non-monogamous relationship, in a way where I respect myself, where I'm not harmful to myself, but equally where I respect my partner or partners if I have more than one, in a way that can be honest and kind and mindful of them and their reality, and not just about myself. And that must require, or could require, that I sometimes have to either have difficult conversations or admit to something that I don't want to admit to, or not allow myself certain things that I might wish because my partner, might. And it's not I mean, we already have clear scripts around that. It's not a strange thing to think that, in one household, one partner might be vegetarian and the other not. And
Mm,
so
mm.
how does a couple negotiate where they go for a meal or what they eat, or, in a way where both people can be respected and considered. And um, I mean, that's something that is perhaps less emotive than monogamy, but it is the same principle that we would use. As how do we have those conversations, particularly if there's differences in that?
Does this conversation come up um, when you're single, or you in an open relationship, or you also, that depends on what you consider an open relationship to be. But if you do booty calls, or just do hookups, uh, does the conversation about monogamy ever come into play? Is it ever addressed, or is it just, listen, you know what this is? So it's like in your face.
I think I think for me, the question here is about, does the ethical aspect of that come up? So if I was to just have sexual encounters with people, then if I imply that I want to have a relationship with you, but I know I only want to have sex with you, then I'm being unethical, right? On
Mm,
the other hand, I can have multiple sexual partners. And if I am clear with all of them, I don't wish to have a relationship with you. This is about sex. And if you wish to engage me in that way, then that's what we do. And we have sex, and that's great, right? And in that sense, it's very ethical. It becomes problematic when we start to be dishonest with each other, right? Where we imply something that doesn't happen or that is not our
mm,
intention. It's not so much about how many people I have sex with or I don't have sex with. In this book that I refer to as The Ethical Slut, the authors reclaim the word slut, which was, of course, a word that was used to control women and around their sexuality, and yeah, put them in a very negative position. They reclaim this, and call themselves ethical sluts, but then they also elaborate on that in terms of, that term is usually referred or associated with women, but they make it gender
mm.
neutral, so men can also be sluts. And then they have something which, a concept which I find is really beautiful and playful, a non-practicing slut. And that might be somebody that holds in mind,
Excuse me.
it holds in mind that to have multiple partners, to have open relationships is a possibility. It's a possibility for others. It might be a possibility for me, but it's not something that I am doing right now. So I don't have a need to judge others who might do that. I might never do that myself, but I can respect that that is a healthy way of having a relationship, provided I'm ethical about
mm.
that. And that, again, the ethical aspect of it is also just for sexual encounters, not necessarily relationships.
And so you touched on control, and I'm wondering if monogamy is truly about love and commitment, or is it ownership and control?
That's a very complex question, Lynette. And I would say it's probably a bit of both, because some people do prefer to have monogamous relationships because they understand them, they're familiar, they are containing, they are safe places to be. And that is a choice that people make. That is not about
Mm,
control. Right?
mm,
But in order to be in that relationship, there is a certain level of control. Now, we then necessarily would frame control in a negative way. But if you think about it, if you buy a car, there's control in terms of this is what you have to do in order to have this car. This is what is required of you, etc., etc., etc. Right. So the idea that there
mm,
isn't control or that control necessarily is a bad thing, um, I don't think
mm,
that that's true. Control can be a really healthy thing, but it is about how do we do it in a healthy way. So how do we understand we both want to be in a monogamous relationship because being in that means that I do have a certain sense of knowing how the structure, more so than maybe I,
yes,
but how the structure
yes.
controls both of us, and therefore I feel safe in that for both of us, right? Um, and there is control, but it needn't be abusive in that way.
Mm. I can see absolute makes sense. Also, when that, because you're clear with each other that this is how we're going to negotiate and navigate our relationship and be in the relationship, that clarity and that security that it provides is, others might see it as control, but it's the certainty and
Sure.
the belief that the my partner and I, we've both committed, vowed, signed up for this kind of relationship.
Exactly. And then I have chosen this control,
Mm,
right? So then this control is not abusive or in any way negative
mm,
because it's something that I have
mm.
chosen to do, right? Um, yeah, as you say, that we've signed up to that, and then it becomes something that can be very containing in that way.
I'm going to ask a last question for you, but also for our viewers. And you are welcome if you're listening to our conversation about monogamy. And I don't know where you are in your relationship. If you want to share and comment about that, that'd be great. But I would really like to know from our viewers um, if monogamy for them is natural, or is it we just go with the flow because that's what we've known and that is what we have been taught. I'm very curious, so drop me a comment in the comment section your thoughts about that. So your take on it, Eli.
I don't think that we can say it is either of those. I think that for
Okay.
many people, monogamy is the most familiar, safe option. And that doesn't mean that it is less than. It might be very much a celebration for them and a choice that they make in a place where they want to be, right? And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And then the idea of
Mm,
anything that is non-monogamous feels very foreign to them, very strange, and they we shouldn't then think but they must be able to go there, right? And so I think
mm, mm,
it's not whether it is natural or not, because I find that word a bit uncomfortable. It's rather what have we grown into that we feel safe with and that
mm,
feels familiar to us. And it might be because all my ancestors have always only been monogamous for the last 300 years, and that's fine, that's perfectly fine. On the other hand, within, let's lose certain African tradition where a man is allowed to have many women, and as a woman, I want to be one of several women to my husband, and that's what works for me, and that's what I choose. And some people might say, "Man, that's not monogamy," but it is actually a form of plural monogamy, and that's
mm.
what she feels comfortable with. Then that's perfectly reasonable for her, and that is her natural. If we use that, yeah.
What's interesting was whilst you were responding, I thought just because you've known a certain way or a construct of a relationship does not make that which is different lesser or less valued or less important than what you've known, because it's what you negotiate, is how you set it up. And people that are in relationships where they've negotiated having multiple partners, that's their relationship. It does not mean it weighs less or is of lesser value because you've
Exactly.
only known one way.
And I think,
Way
Lynette,
that's
what you
really
highlight there is sort of a human tendency that we often tend to judge something that we don't understand because it makes us feel a bit unsafe. And in judging it, we can remove it rather than actually having to think and understand it, even though it's not for us, but to think about how it works. And there's multiple examples in all aspects of life how we do that. And so you're quite right. If we can be healthy with ourselves and our fellow human beings, then we have to accept that people live different lives with different relationship structures around monogamy or non-monogamy or whatever it is. And that doesn't mean it's less, it's more, it's honest, it's dishonest. It could be either of those in any of those constructs. The healthy option is the agreed to, open, considered, respectful, mindful, agreed relationship, whether that be monogamy or non-monogamy, slightly irrelevant then.
we listen and we do not judge.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.